Although all of the attention right now is on the aftermath of the Moscow theater attack, we are in the midst of a broader rise in militant groups playing pivotal roles in the greater geopolitical sphere. You only need to turn back the calendar a few months to get to the start of the Houthi attacks along the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandab Strait. The response there, of course, is still ongoing. Then you only need to roll back 2 more months to October 7th to get to the start of this saga, Hamas's attack on Israel. And once more, the response there is still ongoing. Each of these cases, to some degree, have a common motivation: to bring media attention to the specific organization, and with that, the hope of greater recruitment and funding. Although this channel often touches on militant recruiting incentives, we need to do a full, deep dive today, because the incentive to use violence as a form of advertisement has critical implications for the Kremlin right now. It both helps explain why the attack on the outskirts of Moscow happened, and it reveals the broader possibility that Russia has a deterrence problem. As such, we will begin today's video with a broad overview of the aforementioned incentive to use violence like advertisements, with a special focus on how militant groups select targets, the opponent's identity, the location, its defenses, and the expected retaliation, before specifically looking at ISIS-K's calculus with Russia, and the deeper problem that Russia faces if it continues to shift its response toward Ukraine. But we begin with the big picture violence as advertisement framework. In broad strokes, groups view violence as a trade-off between eyeballs and retribution. The gamble is that an attack will bring a larger return on the investment than whatever a retaliatory strike takes away. In a moment, we will get to the attributes of a target that make that target attractive. But focusing on just militant group dynamics for now, competition between groups is a big factor, and not just because my academic alter ego wrote a book about that subject. Much like a business that has a monopoly, a group has little need to advertise its services when they are the only game in town. But when there are competitors in the same marketplace, a little bit of brand recognition goes a long way. Now, to be clear, the big 3 players at the moment do not share an identical market. Each has its own ideological bent. So this is less like multiple cola brands facing off, and more like a cola, a lemon-lime soft drink, and an orange soda. In other words, there is some overlap in the marketplace, especially when it comes to donations, but they are not carbon copies of each other. Indeed, we can see this with how Iran is presumed to be giving support to Hamas, despite a stark difference in beliefs, and the Houthis directly competing for those resources. But the most ideologically inclined of individuals may not be crossing over. But just as important of a question as when to attack is where to attack. First in importance, a prerequisite if you will, is the identity of the target itself. On one hand, the Houthis could attack North Korea, but on the other, the audiences sympathetic to the Houthi movement would probably look at it, ask, but why, and then move on with their lives. There needs to be some sort of propaganda of the deed, as we call it in the discipline. Best to stick to targets that will resonate with the prospective donors and followers. But even then, especially if you are a group like ISIS that has spent the last decade making enemies of everyone, there will still be many targets to choose from. Now the group needs to begin asking themselves some strategic questions. How easy is it to get access to the potential target country? A location on the other side of the world looks less attractive than, say, the place where you are literally in the middle of fighting a civil war. Next, the group needs to consider the target's defenses. Once militants have arrived, is there a soft location that will result in massive damage? Or is everything of value so tied down by security that all operatives deployed there will only end up getting themselves arrested? Like the flow of water, militant groups prefer the path of least resistance. Then there is the retaliation afterward. Remember that the profits subtract out whatever the group expects to lose through the target state's offensive response. Choose poorly, and all of those new recruits, and all of that cash pouring in, will just go up in smoke. Pick a weaker target, and you get to keep more of the booty. Plus, you can brag about how you scared the target into submission. In fact, defensive protections and offensive retaliation create a deeper problem for potential target states. When one country increases its defensive posture, groups become less inclined to target it. But that is equivalent to saying that every other potential target country becomes a relatively more attractive place to strike. As such, investing in defensive measures looks doubly attractive. You become less likely to be the target of an attack, and even if you ultimately are targeted, you expect to take less damage. Meanwhile, the benefit of offensive operations is partially to punish earlier militant strikes, but it is mainly about degrading a group's capacity. But think about this for a second. That is a degraded capacity to strike not only your state, but also the other. Worse yet, the group's audience will be upset by your intervention, increasing the group's propaganda value for a successful attack against you. That does not mean that states never engage in offensive countermeasures. Clearly they do. Just that there tends to be an overproduction in defensive protections, and an underproduction in proactive counterplay. With those general principles out of the way, we can start understanding why ISIS-K may have chosen Russia as its target on that day. Whether it is propaganda value, access to a target, expected defense, or expected response, Russia was vulnerable across the board. Normally, groups have to think about the trade-offs between the categories. One target may be better prepared in one area, but more vulnerable in others. However, there was not much of a trade-off to speak of here. Regarding propaganda value, Russia is a big country. It may not be the United States, but it is still one of the biggest geopolitical players. There is a reason why you have heard about what happened in Moscow, even as other ISIS-K operations in Afghanistan or Pakistan go unnoticed. By the way, there were 48 of them in 2023 alone. Further, there is audience appetite to target Russia as well. We discussed Russia's connection to the Syrian civil war in the immediate aftermath of the attack, so I will not rehash that now. But beyond Syria, between 7 to 10% of Russia's population is Muslim, concentrated in the Caucasus and near Kazakhstan. Plus, there are lingering grievances from the Chechen wars. Activating that group would open up a much larger front. There was a hint of political problems as well, with Russia de facto recognizing the Taliban government in Afghanistan. This is one of the regions that ISIS-K calls home, and the Taliban and ISIS-K have been rivals there for years. Access was also straightforward. All 4 accused perpetrators are Tajik citizens. Indeed, the legacy of the Soviet Union drags on here. Russia extends visa-free entry to all post-Soviet states, except for the ones that you might imagine. Fun fact, Ukraine is actually still included on the approved list, but good luck to anyone trying that. Anyway, we recently discussed Russia's demographics troubles, and how immigration is key for the Russian economy to keep going. Well, visa-free entry for post-Soviet states, many of whose citizens still dream of reaching Moscow as their endgame goal, is part of that. But for the alleged perpetrators, it meant that they could enter Russia without much scrutiny. Moving on, defense is a bit of a mixed bag. Russia has expanded its National Guard activities since the war began. You are likely most familiar with this due to the Wagner Group's failed Thunder Run from the summer of 2023, and the subsequent internal reinforcement afterward, though ironically enough they are now recruiting from the ex-Wagner ranks. What is less well known is that the National Guard was a part of the original invasion force. They were supposed to stay behind and administer the newly held territories. That plan failed in Kyiv, of course. But now that Russia controls significant chunks of 4 oblasts and has legally integrated them into the Federation, National Guard troops are also preoccupied with internationally recognized Ukraine. In any case, the important thing here is that the National Guard is more of a reactive defensive force, designed to stop crises as they happen, and they are concentrated in and around Ukraine. Meanwhile, proactive defense, that is, finding and arresting would-be attackers after they enter the country, but before they get underway, falls within the realm of intelligence agencies. The FSB in particular ought to deal with domestic threats. However, due to a historical quirk, the FSB also handles Russian intelligence regarding post-Soviet states, meaning that its resources have also been concentrating on Ukraine. And though the war has not led to any major internal uprisings, well, not any civilian ones at least, it has sparked sufficient discontent to further distract the FSB with Russian threats to the state. All of this is to say that there was a large hole in the system for a non-Ukraine entity to pass through. At the same time, the United States has accurately foreshadowed ISIS-K's 2 major international operations this year: January's attack at a memorial for General Qasem Soleimani in Iran, and then the Moscow theater attack itself. Now, consistent with its duty-to-warn policy that we have covered before, Washington alerted those countries in advance. It is unclear whether they failed to heed the warnings because of a broader skepticism of the United States, or because Washington's desire to protect intelligence-gathering methods led to warnings too vague to be useful. At least in the Russian case, more recent reporting indicates that Iran also warned Moscow, specifically suggesting that it was an issue of vagueness, perhaps in conjunction with being otherwise busy dealing with Ukraine, that led to the failure. Regardless, if the target were in America, the United States would not have those same trust and communication problems. All of this is to say that the United States looks like a less attractive target. But that implies that Russia is a relatively more attractive target. The last consideration is what kind of offensive response Russia might take. And again, Russia was looking at a bottleneck. The war in Ukraine has been incredibly draining both in terms of life and materiel. Thus, a group might expect some type of response, but it would be far from, say, the United States going after Afghanistan in 2001. And that, in particular, takes us to Russia's deeper problem. As it stands, the predominant narrative coming out of the Kremlin is that the ultimate culpability for the attack falls on Ukraine. If actions match that rhetoric, then the Kremlin will take whatever martial latitude that a rally round the flag effect brings about, and also apply it westward. As a first cut, this is obviously bad for sapping ISIS-K capabilities, at a time when the group has demonstrated the ability to cause Russia great pain. But it is actually much worse than that. As I foreshadowed earlier, the central trade-off for violence as advertisement is the boon of additional resources versus the loss from retaliatory strikes. If Russia does not go on an offensive, then, for militant groups, there is no longer any trade-off. All militant groups, not just ISIS-K, but any so inclined to strike a Russian target, can have their cake and eat it too. Or as they say in the Levant, you can have the egg and the eggshell. Or as they say in Yemen, you could have the meat from your sheep and have your sheep walk. Those are real expressions, by the way. In any case, the point is that it would make for open season in Russia. No need for militant groups to think about other targets. There is a high-profile target to hit without repercussions. Remember, offensive operations against militant groups already tend to be underprovided. This is just taking it to the extreme. And usually a country just compensates with extra defensive measures, but even that is questionable when Ukraine is the focus. Presumably, of course, the Kremlin is aware of the broader deterrence problem that it faces if there is no reaction. The question is how important of a priority is it relative to Ukraine, and whether Russian citizens or the broader bureaucracy will tolerate it. To wit, there are new restrictions at the border, and there is always the possibility that the Kremlin plans to quietly do quite a bit in terms of countermeasures against ISIS-K, while simultaneously keeping the public narrative squarely focused on Ukraine. But we will have to wait to see if anything more comes of it. In contrast, there is no need to wait if you want to learn more about the war. These books are a fantastic starting point. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. Gotta say, I love how I did an entire video on free riding, and someone leaves a generous donation. The irony there is delicious. But seriously, you guys are the best.